So welcome everyone to this IES webinar, Supporting Interdisciplinary Climate Action. This webinar has been organised by our climate action community as part of London Climate Action Week. This webinar will explore examples of interdisciplinary climate change work in action, providing insights on how professionals can support change across sectors. We're delighted to be joined by three speakers who will explore this topic, and I will introduce in turn before their presentation. As always, there'll be a chance to ask questions at the end of the presentation, so please do submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation, and I will ask these on your behalf later. If your question is for a specific speaker, then please note that in your question. Thank you for logging in. I will now introduce our first speaker, Guy Finkel, a PhD researcher at the University of Manchester. His PhD is titled Governing Industrial Emissions, an Analysis of the UK's Cluster Sequencing of Carbon Capture, Usage and Storage Deployment. Guy is a consultant researcher at both UNCTAD and Lund University, working on projects that map finance flows and the use of bonds in petrochemical industry, as well as the rise of hydrogen economy across the Nordics. Thank you, guys. I'll just hand over to you.
Thanks, buddy. I'll just get my screen shared. Is that looking fine? Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, correct. You can see that. Okay, yep.
Nice. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, as mentioned, I'm Guy. Hello. Thanks for welcoming me today. Yeah, as mentioned, I'm a going into my third year of PhD research at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, based at the University of Manchester. Yeah, and looking basically at the governance of industrial decarbonisation, especially the clusters which hug the coastline around the UK. But today I'm going to speak a bit on the wider projects I've been involved with over the past couple of years from an interdisciplinary perspective. So kind of having a look at the benefits of perceiving dynamic and evolving challenges related to climate change through a range of disciplinary perspectives, with a few little case studies of research I've been involved with that have utilized interdisciplinary methods and how this manner of research can potentially translate into impact research, as hard as that can be to predict. So yeah, just a quick little overview. Let's see if I can get rid of this thing. There we go. Of the work I've been involved with, the interdisciplinary nature of it. So back in 2016, I started doing a double master's in sustainable development and environmental science, which was co-hosted by these two universities, Uppsala and the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. And my studies were a mix of kind of the both social and natural sciences. This was followed by working for, just part-time at the Centre for Environment and Development Studies, which was also part of teaching me the master's, where I coordinate 3 bachelor level courses, all concerning sustainability in some fashion. During the pandemic, I was a research assistant at Lund University in the south of Sweden, firstly at their Centre for Sustainability Studies, so you became a bit of a theme here, and then at the Department of Political Science. Yeah. And I've had a couple of projects running concurrently with these work at the UN branch of Trade and Development. Yeah, as well as doing my primary research. And now finally I'm undertaking my PhD research at Manchester. And throughout all of these studies and roles, interdisciplinary research and also collaboration has played a huge part throughout all of them. But I'll delve a bit deeper into each of them. So whilst I was at Luxus, as an RA, I worked with kind of leading authors in the field on the topic of negative emissions and other forms of climate engineering being utilized as a strategy of mitigation deterrence. This is kind of like a new burgeoning field as countries and companies alike are battling the challenges of decarbonization amidst the emergence of this net zero era that we find ourselves in. As part of the work, we mapped movements in the corporate world as commitments to net zero came to the fore. And we were assessing the methodologies that were being used in order to reach quite lofty climate ambitions. Specifically, we wanted to focus on the perceived management of residual emissions, i.e. how much emissions would still be left over after every conceivable step had been taken across all scopes to decarbonize. Of course, every conceivable step is quite subjective depending on who's answering the question. So it was interesting to tease out information about how residual emissions are defined, depending on perspective, and what measures are often suggested to counter them. And this interdisciplinary process allows us to go deep into understanding how corporates were dealing with the paradoxical crises of capitalism in an era where biophysical limits to growth were starting to get recognized on an international stage, and thus the looming threat of stringent top-down regulation was kind of mobilizing major corporate actors to kind of jump on the net zero bandwagon, so to speak. This research was predominantly social science, but it did include a large amount of quantitative research to track movements in the corporate sphere. Also at the same university, but at the Department of Political Science, I was involved in a project working alongside the Department of Energy Systems, looking at the role of petrochemicals in the context of climate change, kind of a sector which often goes underlooked with so much focus on the fossil fuel like main extractors and distributors, but a little bit more down the value chain. They kind of go a little bit unseen. This was a 2-year project with an interwoven report chapters published as individual academic articles. And from an impact perspective, outside of academia, we ended up presenting findings as evidence for the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee on Plastic Pollution, a bit of a mouthful, who was working towards a global plastics treaty under the umbrella of the UN's Environment Programme. And on this project, we had chemical scientists, engineers, economists, and academics from both political science and political ecology. This research involved quite a lot of quantitative analysis, but our project also touched upon discursive narratives, which are currently being employed by the petrochemical industry, which is being faced with necessary and rapid decarbonisation. So some interesting interdisciplinary research that we did was to assess the financing of all petrochemical projects with a value of over $1 billion, which are depicted in this Sankey figure on the left here, with a couple of high-profile case studies where we saw large-scale petrochemical projects that had received multiple streams of public and private financing, which kind of really highlighted geopolitical energy and material relationships getting locked into decadal-long infrastructural projects, which again then in turn can contribute heavily to the term of carbon lock-in. Our research was also used as supportive evidence in a case brought against INEOS in their Project One by the NGO Client Earth and also 13 other kind of sister NGOs on the project, that allowed the Flanders municipality, where the project was going to be based, to revoke the permits to construct a 3 billion euros plastics refinery in the port of Antwerp. Great news, but sadly this decision has now been overturned as of just January this year. But nevertheless, this research we were engaged in helps to bolster these causes, which can potentially set legal precedents in some cases, unfortunately not in this particular case. And this research that we were using to be used in this was past examples of the INEOS's blatant greenwashing, coupled with data on an increase in absolute emissions across all of their facilities, if you take like a net overview, despite bold claims of reductions in emissions intensity. And since the publication of our collated research on petrochemicals, multiple NGOs, such as the Centre for International Environmental Law, have been in touch to set up workshops and learn more about how to find leverage points to transform and decarbonize a notoriously hard to abate sector. And during my work at Lund University, I was seconded to the UN branch of Trade and Development. We had a senior economist attending one of our kind of outreach workshops that we were hosting. And this was to look at finance flows in the petrochemicals industry, in particular the role of the bond market in this, and how the use of green bonds can be used to help decarbonize the industry at an accelerated rate. It was kind of very similar to the work I was already doing at Lund, but with a more general global focus, as per the remit of the UN. So our analysis of the role of central banks and also multilateral development banks in steering a low carbon transition was actually picked up and featured in the 2021 UN Trade and Development Report, which of course has a wide readership, including finance ministers across the world. What was particularly useful in this research was to contextualize finance flows and the frameworks that they adhere to in what can be deemed eligible for different pockets of funds and financing, and what is really kind of defined as green, which allowed us to raise multiple discussion points around varying shades of green, which then will have like material repercussions ranging from like incremental, shallow kind of reform, all the way down to deep transformation, depending on how you define that level of green or sustainable. And yeah, from where we are now, as part of my research, I've been presenting some of my findings and papers at a couple of these prominent conferences. There's the Beyond Oil conference in Bergen in Norway, and I've just got back from the political ecology conference that was hosted in Lund, Dodoma, and Lima. Obviously, I went to the one in Sweden. Yeah, my current research aims to act as kind of a heads up to the incumbent or perhaps even incoming UK government on the different options available for delivering a low carbon transition within UK industry. And our analysis at the moment is kind of depicting how the current decarbonisation pathway that is on is steered by strong dominant discourse, financial norms, and a range of powerful actors. But thus, possible alternative scenarios can be equally changed by fundamental shifts in these norms that we currently have, as we've identified thus far. And I guess looking forward, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero would be the most relevant government body, unless it shifts under the next cabinet reshuffle or whatever it might be. But who we'll be looking to engage with, and hopefully we'll be able to utilize this research to advise policymakers and all the relevant stakeholders as they grapple with the necessity to decarbonize in an equitable manner, whilst also at an ever increased rate as we have failed to deliver year on year since we have started trying to meet our statutory carbon budgets and net zero by 2050. My department has a lot of experience with preparing post notes, providing reliable and impartial scientific research evidence for UK Parliament. So we already have good connections there, which I'd like to hopefully tap into to try and mobilize this research and potentially have some kind of impact from it beyond the realm of academia. Just my quick takeaway messages then for this. Interdisciplinary research is integral when dealing with wicked problems that we are meeting a barrage of with climate change, of course. It can be conducted within a single research project or paper, not just on like a cross-faculty or cross-university basis. The impact of your research, despite however you want to intend, it can be almost impossible to plan, and thus it can come from very unexpected places, which has happened with our research so far. But that will undoubtedly benefit from outreach and disseminations of results and findings when you have them. And of course, collaboration is integral, especially with non-academic institutions, in not only providing valuable research, but to get it out there, to share it. Thanks for your time today. I'm also involved in some environmental justice movements outside the world of academia as another form of direct climate action, but happy to discuss more either in the Q&A or if you want to get in touch, I'd be happy to chat more. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. Just a reminder, if you have any questions for Guy, please pop them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. So next up, we'll hear from Emma Knight-Strong. Emma is a chartered environmentalist and fellow of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. As a sustainability professional with over 15 years experience in the environmental consultancy and sustainable finance sectors, Emma specialises in sustainability governance, strategic sustainability, and integration of sustainability and ESG considerations into business as usual. Emma founded Green Arch Consulting in 2018 and has supported a broad range of clients across multiple sectors, disciplines, and geographies in developing and evolving their approach to sustainability and climate change. Thank you, Emma. I'll now hand over to you.
Thanks very much, David. Appreciate that. Hopefully you can see my slides okay. My title is Driving Climate Action in Green Infrastructure Investment. One of the things I was thinking was, what do we mean by interdisciplinary action on climate in this context? So I'll go into that in a little bit, but just to start with, a little bit more about Green Arch Consulting very, very quickly. We're a boutique sustainability and ESG consultancy. We work with a range of clients on anything from policies to embedding management systems, developing route maps and transition pathways, as well as impact management and measurement, and a range of other services. If it sounds interesting, we'll probably usually say yes to it. A little bit of background. David gave you a bit of my background. I've been working in the kind of sustainability and ESG field for about 15 years-ish. Before I launched Green Arch Consulting in 2018, I worked at the Green Investment Group, which was previously the Green Investment Bank, it was previously owned by the UK government. So I worked for 5 years in the green infrastructure investment space. Prior to that, I was in environmental consulting, due diligence, environmental impact assessment, and generally planning. So that's kind of the background that I've come from. Education-wise, I studied environmental sciences and a master's in environmental law. So I was trying to figure out what exactly do we mean by interdisciplinary action in green infrastructure investment. And this is my interpretation of it. There may be multiple interpretations, but the way that I've kind of broken this down is figuring out how in the finance space, how do different teams interact within financial institutions and what are their different roles and responsibilities, how ESG or the environmental, social and governance team, or sometimes very often individual, works and interacts with those teams. And then also, how do you integrate it across the decision-making structure? Now, as Guy sort of talked about in his talk, there is a massive need for investment into this transition, this infrastructure transition. According to the International Energy Agency, we need $4.5 trillion a year invested into clean energy by 2030 just to get anywhere close to 1.5. Those of us who work in this space are probably fairly convinced that 1.5 might not happen now, but to give you a bit of an idea, last year the investment in clean energy was $1.8 trillion. Now, that's a huge amount of money, but it isn't as much as we need. So there is a huge amount to consider, and there's a lot to think about when it comes to leveraging private sector investment into the green infrastructure space. The first is that there's a lot of different people and a lot of different teams to consider. There's a lot of education, a lot of integration that needs to happen. And as much as it sounds quite strange, because I don't know what your experience is in the finance sector, but before I joined the finance sector, I thought that the bankers were always up for taking a gamble, because it always seemed like they were gambling with people's money. But actually, the finance sector, the infrastructure sector generally is incredibly risk averse, and it doesn't like to do anything that doesn't have at least a 30-year guarantee sitting on it, which makes it very difficult to bring in new technologies and interesting technologies into the pipeline. Part of that is that new technologies, new concepts take longer to due diligence. They take longer for the various teams to get comfortable with them. And if you are working in a team that is incentivized, i.e. your bonus depends on how many deals you get done, or the value of those deals, or the amount of profit that's made off those deals, then why would you spend 18 months trying to get one small project across the line when you could just spend 6 months getting a huge project across the line that you know very well, and it's a rinse and repeat situation. So there's a bit of there's a difficulty with incentivization, and there is huge work going into trying to change some of that. But there's other teams as well. So those are just the investment teams. Those are the guys the people that bring the projects to an investment committee to make the decision. But within an organization, within a financial services organization, you will have people responsible for strategy. Those are usually the senior people, and they will be using data on market assessments and general market forecasting to develop out their strategy as an organization. So they will need to be considering the transition risk. They will need to be considering the new technologies that are coming down the line, the risk of any of their existing investments becoming stranded assets, i.e. they can't sell them because nobody wants them. They will need to be considering a huge amount in collaboration with other teams and bringing in concepts around climate change. That isn't as common as you would think. That when organizations are thinking about strategy, it isn't routine yet for them to be considering things like that. It's getting there, I'd say, but certainly, and it's got there quicker over the last few years, but it isn't as common as those of us who work in this field every single day would imagine it should be. You've also got the finance team, and it sounds a bit strange because it's financial services sector, but obviously not everyone in that organization is a finance specialist. The finance team themselves, there's a number of different teams that sit within them, but you've got a team that will be just responsible for valuations. Their job will be to value the existing assets. They also have a huge amount of knowledge and experience on data control, assurance, and audit. There's two reasons why that's important. The first one, of course, valuations, is if they are not taking into consideration climate risk and the risk of stranded assets and transition risk. And feel free to ask me to elaborate on any of these terms in the questions as well. But if you haven't come across them before, I'm working on the basis that most people will have come across most of these terms before. But if the valuations team aren't routinely integrating those into their valuations, then they are not considering the full impact of climate change on the value of the assets. One of the other things that we have to consider, though, in the environmental, social, and governance space and in the sustainability space, is that there is more and more push to be data-driven and to avoid the risk of greenwashing. Now, sustainability specialists are perfectly capable of pulling together all of the data, but that risks the one or two sustainability specialists in the organization just purely becoming a data reporting function. And that isn't necessarily where our strengths lie, albeit, we're pretty good at data, but there are better ways to do it. And in fact, there is increasingly a push now to make sure that the ESG data is reportable alongside the financial data. So it makes huge sense to work directly with the finance teams to figure out how best to integrate ESG data into what they do. So whether we can use the same platforms that they use, or whether we can report data in the same way that they do, means that you've got more integration across the piece, and the data and the presentation of that data is more familiar to the decision makers at the top of the organization. It also means that you're following similar processes for assurance and audit, which means that when your data does get assured, and within the next couple of years, this will become standard, there's huge opportunity there to make sure that you're kind of driving the same processes and delivering information in the same way. You also then have to consider risk generally. So the overall risk management function of the organization needs to start integrating ESG climate considerations. Often in finance, in financial services, there is a separate team that deals with just the ESG risk or just the finance risk, just the climate risk. That, of course, isn't fully integrating the considerations. So trying to figure out how best to integrate that, make sure that risks are measured across the same in the same way, is a really key area. And it sounds relatively obvious, but it isn't as obvious as you might think. Legal and compliance. So one of the key things that we have to consider with financial services is compliance. So making sure that we are complying with all of the various different regulations, and there are a lot of regulations in this space now in the financial services sector. But typically speaking, these days, it's the ESG team's responsibility to make sure that that compliance is happening. Now, that ESG team were probably hired for a completely different reason. They weren't necessarily hired to be compliance specialists. But it has now become a major part of their role. So again, there's a huge amount of pressure going on to the ESG team that are sitting in the middle of all of this, trying to make sure that everything's being coordinated. So figuring out how to embed the ESG compliance into the other compliance teams is really, really important. And the legal side as well. So making sure that contracts routinely include sustainability related considerations and ESG related considerations, and consider climate change risks and challenges is really important. And likewise, negotiation, making sure that that stuff is discussed really early on, rather than being brought in late in the day when it might get a lot of pushback. That, of course, then also means that when we're looking at different infrastructure assets, we have to consider climate change in due diligence. It sounds really obvious, but it isn't routinely considered in scopes of works. Even in environmental scopes of works, it's not routinely considered, albeit environmental consultants will typically pull it in because it's an important part to consider. But climate risk and climate action generally won't be in part of the scope of works in the legal due diligence. It won't routinely be part of the scope of works in the technical due diligence. So considering the impact of wildfires on solar panels and the yield, the yield of a solar farm isn't standard. It's not something necessarily that will be considered. Now, that might be okay if you're in England, but less okay if you're on the west coast of the United States and you're dealing with wildfire smog for 6 weeks at a time during the summer. So there's some really interesting areas where climate risk and climate considerations need to be integrated into the way that different teams operate in order to actually achieve climate action. Likewise with stakeholder expectations, so considering engaging different stakeholders and asking the right questions. A lot of stakeholder engagement with financial services considers very routine things, the same things that they've been considering for a very long time, but adding in a couple of additional questions can really help open up the debate and open up the dialogue around climate action. Comms and marketing, there's a very big push to talk about green and to talk about green things that are happening, but avoiding greenwashing is now a regulatory requirement, certainly in the UK and around Europe and elsewhere is becoming increasingly important. So making sure to engage with communications and marketing teams, but also to get information back from the comms and marketing teams. There's a reason why they're talking about green so much, and it's because everyone wants to hear it. So making sure that the comms and marketing teams are bringing that information back into the organization and saying the reason we want to talk about this is because all of our stakeholders want to hear it, then increases the likelihood that the senior decision makers are going to start pushing to do more of it, so that you can talk about it more. One of the other things that ESG teams have to do in financial services is do a lot of reporting to various different committees. They might be investment committees, they might be risk committees, they might be the board, they might be anything else. Developing consistency of language is really key for this, and making sure that you're presenting information in a way that will be understood by those committees. And again, that's where we're speaking to all of these other different teams, finance team, risk and legal, can be really beneficial, because there's no point reinventing the wheel. If there's a way that they present information that's been working for a long time, trying to make sure that the environmental and social information is presented in a similar way can really help to engage brains and can really help to engage the teams. So why have I talked about it from this perspective? Well, one of the things that we say needs to happen a lot is we need to bring private sector finance in to to be able to achieve any of this. I'm not going to go into the merits or otherwise of capitalism because that's too long for today, but this is the system that we have to work with. And so we have to understand how it works in order to try and drive action, to try and achieve change. So one of the things that we have to do is make sure that this is integrated across the decision-making structure. And as with environmental assessments or anything similar, you'd go through a screening stage first. So with the decision-making structure in a financial services organization, they will screen a project to see whether it aligns with their appetite. So making sure that that appetite sort of screens out anything that is not going to work from a climate perspective starts to then get really interesting. And there's been lots of work on taxonomies to develop, what types of technologies are relatively green, and also kind of the greener side of infrastructure investing, and making sure that your screening takes that into account is really important. And then during the due diligence, as I said earlier, making sure that we're bringing the climate-related considerations, environmental and social considerations into the due diligence process. And like I said, it sounds really obvious, but this isn't routinely embedded unless the processes are built in, and unless it is very clear what they have to do and how they have to do it. It isn't routinely happening in a lot of cases. And even where it is routinely happening, there are ways to improve it. So thinking about how that all works, that then feeds into the investment decision-making gates. And there will be, in any organization, there will be sort of 3 to 4-ish decision-making gates where an investment can be stopped. It's a stop-go situation. You either continue with your due diligence or continue with the negotiations, or you stop and cut your losses. So those gates have to routinely have some level of environmental and social considerations and climate-related considerations throughout those gates. Otherwise, you're not thinking about it until too late in the process. Once an investment has been made, the likelihood is that the team that makes that investment will not be responsible for looking after that asset or that investment going forward. Someone else will be responsible for managing it. So making sure that the information is transitioned across from the investment team to the asset management team or the portfolio management team is really key, and making sure that it's in a consistent format and making sure that it is very clear what the risks are and what the mitigation approach should be. That then leads to the ongoing management and making sure that developing out methods for implementing all of the mitigation, tracking whether that mitigation is even happening, making sure that any missing documentation is developed and dealt with is really key for sell down or refinancing. So making sure that when you need to refinance that asset or when you need to sell that asset, that all of your documentation is in place, which is why I've got here in a bullet point with exclamation mark, paperwork, because a lot of this really comes down to paperwork and making sure that it's all been pulled together and all is in a really clear location, and everything is consistently communicated. The reason I'm bringing this up is because there are so many people in the environmental space who have some touch point with this. They might not be directly involved in the finance decision-making structure. They might not be doing due diligence, but they might be doing environmental impact assessments for the development of an asset. Thinking about how best to present the information so that it can be easily brought out of a document and added into a finance decision-making structure is actually a really key thing, because if all of the different mitigants required to improve climate performance of a particular asset are spread across a document, it's easier, or it's harder to make sure that all of those mitigants then get correctly communicated across the piece, and that the finance teams take them into account, put them into the asset management budget, and take all of that into account when they're valuing the asset. So making sure that it is all really clear and clearly in one location is actually really, really key. And it's something that over the years of working in environmental consulting and at project development stage and then through into finance, that communication isn't as obvious as you would expect it to be. And being able to kind of integrate the information into an organization that is wholly focused on getting deals across the line. There are a lot of people within those organizations who would very much love to be focusing on other things, but they are forced to be blinkered by closing deals. That's what they have to do. So the easier we can make it for them to close deals that don't destroy the planet, the easier that, the quicker this climate action will be actually driven. So that's one of the things that I was quite keen to communicate across today, and please feel free to ask any questions on what I've said. But there are so many different moving parts in the finance sector, and I'm really keen to make sure that everyone understands at least what those basic moving parts are, so that you can understand that it isn't as straightforward as just flipping a switch and suddenly diverting cash into the climate related sectors. There are so many different parts to consider, different levels of education and integration that need to happen, and that is happening. It's just not necessarily happening as quickly as we would want it to. So the more we all understand how it works, the easier it is for us to communicate that information where it needs to be communicated. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Emma. Like I say, if anyone has any questions, please pop them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So finally, I'm pleased to introduce Sarah Legg, Associate Director of the Air Quality Team at ARUP, working on air quality policy strategy in cities and the intersection of air pollution and climate. She is an air quality specialist with a particular interest in the overlap of air quality and other issues, particularly climate change and health. Sarah is on the steering group for EPIC, the Environmental Policy Implementation Community, and chair of the task group on air quality and climate change guidance. Previously, as chair of the Air Quality Committee at Environmental Protection UK, she was heavily involved in lobbying the government for strong and effective legislation, policy and action on air pollution and the environment. So thanks, Sarah. I'll now hand over to you.
Great. Thanks, Derek. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, we can.
Brilliant. Let me just get it. Brilliant. Okay. And thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk at this Climate Action Week event for the climate action community. Actually supporting interdisciplinary climate change action is something I feel very strongly about in the work I do. I'm an air quality specialist of 25 years plus, but actually I do a lot of work on the intersection between air quality and climate change, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that today, that intersection, but also a little bit about the EPIC guidance that's about to be released. So let me so who are EPIC? You may not have heard of them before. Basically, we're a new IES community, but we have a very long history. We were created in 2023, and it's a community of environmental experts that look at the implementation of policies that lead to the protection and regeneration of our natural world. So we're really trying to bring together voices to call for both the ambitious and deliverable policy, because without the underlying policy, you can't implement anything effectively, but also to then provide kind of insights, particularly for local authorities and other decision makers, with kind of to help them implement that to really deliver on the ground. We don't have a specific theme. We're not the Institute of Air Quality Management. We're not the climate action community, but we do work across a lot of the different kind of specialisms that may be represented by the IES and the people in our audience today. And actually, one of the best things about EPIC, given that I suspect a lot of you are already IES members, is that actually EPIC membership is free to join if you're already a member of IES. So contact Ellie Savage, who's our policy officer, if you want to join our mailing list and kind of get our newsletters and so on. I'll put her contact details again at the end and perhaps drop in the chat afterwards. Anyway, I just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of background, because actually, although we were only created as an IES community last year, we've actually been going for 125 years plus. We started as the Victorian Smoke Abatement Society, although there are rumours that we had predecessors. So we were involved, not me, I'm not that old, in the 1956 Clean Air Act, and looking at kind of the London pea supers, and we've been heavily involved in kind of more recent things as well, like the Environment Act and making sure that was fit for purpose. We focused on kind of both local and national action, by putting, like I said, putting in place the right legislation in the first place and the right powers and resources, or encouraging those who have control over that to put in the right powers and resources, but also supporting local authorities and others to effectively implement that, to understand how things can most effectively be done. And that has included kind of guidance, it's included training, it's included kind of advocacy, being a critical friend to government, consultation responses, lots of different things. So there's a lot going on. And I just thought, give you a quick flavour of the wider work that we do. I'm going to be talking about the air quality and climate change work today, but we've also got some work going on at the moment with the Institute of Air Quality Management at the IES on air quality and planning. We're doing stuff on nature recovery, both local nature recovery strategies and biodiversity net gain. We've got a new standing group on noise and vibration, because that was one of the expert subgroups we bought from EP UK, and it wasn't something the IES was doing. So there's a really interesting piece of work starting up at the moment. We've got a really interesting project starting up at the moment on implementation science, which is looking about why things policy implementation kind of succeeds or fails. What are the deciding factors, with a view to kind of helping us understand why things fail or succeed, and therefore how we can make them more useful in future, more effective in future. And then there's also, we've got on our inaugural conference this autumn, but we're also kind of popping up all over the place. So you might have seen us in the IES's inaugural dialogue between disciplines conference recently, which again looked at the interdisciplinary aspects of environment. Great, so that's a brief introduction to EPIC. I'm going to talk about air pollution and climate change now, and you might wonder what the connection is there. So I'm going to hopefully beg your patience to have a quick look at the science behind it, because I think it's really, really useful to understand why we're interested in this kind of intersection and why it's so important that we're producing guidance on it. So air pollution and climate change. Air pollution is a major environmental impact. We usually look at the kind of the local environmental and health impacts. 1 in 8 people in the world die because of air pollution. It's causes, I think, 7 million premature deaths, and a lot of loss of quality of life. So it's not just kind of premature death, but it's also kind of illness and quality of life, and it causes everything from respiratory diseases, which is obvious, to cardiovascular problems, but also diabetes, dementia, stroke, cancer, and there's new evidence coming out all the time. So just recently there's been some linkages, some causation linkages found between air pollution and stillborn births, and also even antibiotic resistance. So there's some really interesting connections there, but it's not just kind of, we're not affected equally. There's a disproportionate impact on certain communities, particularly children, particularly the elderly, and those with existing health conditions get a real disproportionate impact. And also there's a disproportionate impact on certain communities, like deprived communities, because they tend to live in the areas of higher pollution. So it links in with environmental justice and equality and equity as well. And in addition to the health impacts, there's also quite a lot of impacts on the rest of kind of our ecosystems and built environment. And climate change, I'm not going to talk too long about climate change. We all know how severe and alarming the impacts of climate change is going to be. It's probably almost definitely the biggest environmental crisis we're facing, and it's going to affect every aspect of our society. I'm going to talk a little bit now about why we're linking these two together. So looking at air pollutants, we've talked about the health impacts, but actually several of them have impacts that are on the climate. So for example, black carbon particulate matter is a short-lived climate pollutant, sometimes known as the short-lived climate forcer. It's the same terminology. It actually, those particles, those black carbon particles, act in a very similar way to CO2, but actually on a much faster timescale. And key sources of those are fossil fuels, biomass and biomass combustion. So anything that's kind of burning things like road traffic, airport shipping, domestic wood burning, diesel generators will be creating both CO2 and black carbon particulate matters. Tropospheric ozone is a major health impact on air pollution with major health impacts, but it's actually a major contributor to climate change because it's a powerful climate change gas. But because it's not emitted as ozone, it's not dealt with through kind of how we look at CO2 and CO2 equivalents. It's something that's formed in the atmosphere from its precursors, which are things like oxides of nitrogen and volatile organic compounds. And sources of ozone include road transport, energy generation, combustion, agriculture is a big factor as well. And we look at it through an air pollution lens, and it's really not looked at through the climate lens. So there's an additional climate benefit that's not being captured in climate work that we can see through air quality work. And actually, I could talk about this for a lot longer, but I don't want to. We wouldn't have time to cover it all. But the other impacts of air pollutants with climate are very complicated. Some of them actually cause global cooling. You might have seen some headlines around that. Some can increase cloud formation, which then kind of has an impact on climate itself. And some things can, darken the ice shelves, and then that affects the reflectivity of the surface. So it's a very complicated pattern of how air pollutants contribute to climate change. But generally, overall, there's a positive impact in that if you can reduce air pollution, you will reduce their climate impact. And you can see this in a graph that it's getting a little bit old now, but I haven't seen an updated one, which looked at how we could achieve, oh, I'm sorry, I've jumped forward. Let me jump back to this one for a moment. I just wanted to show you that this shows that if you look at CO2 actions only, you can get to about 2.5 degree increase. But actually, if you look at CO2 and the short-lived climate pollutant and actions on both of that, so that includes black carbon and also methane and some other ones, then you can actually get below 2. Now, I think we might be looking at need an updated version of this, but it shows the magnitude of the impact that these short-lived climate pollutants can have. And actually, because a lot of them are very short term and have short lifetimes in the atmosphere compared to CO2, they can actually have a faster impact, and the mitigation of them can have a faster impact. And then I just want to stop and talk about climate impacts on air pollution, because actually with a hotter, wetter climate, sorry, it must have gone on to automatic move forward. On a hotter, wetter climate, it's also talked about, it also affects kind of the atmospheric chemistry. So you get more of a buildup of pollution, less dispersion. So you get more summer smogs and higher pollution episodes. You also have a change in what the pollution sources are going to be. There are extra stresses on our physiology. So we'll have more health impact or be more vulnerable to health impacts. And there's going to be an increasing damage to vegetation. So things like the feedback loops in terms of vegetation sinks will be compromised because of air pollution. And I just wanted to share one quick graph, which is, well, it's actually a map of London, which just looked at the difference between two modelling scenarios. The only difference is they used a different year of Met data. The higher one was an average year at that point. I think it's actually 2002, and the bottom one was 2003, which at that time was a very hot year. And you can see that just changing one variable actually had a significant impact on the air pollution. So the other reason we look at it is because actually they've got a lot of common sources. So generally it's combustion, road transport, other transport, energy and heat generation, homes and commercial buildings, industry. And there were also linkages between air pollution, climate mitigation, adaptation and resilience as well, that I will happily talk about, but probably not fit into today's slot. So why are we looking at them together? And it's really about taking a slightly wider perspective to come up with a more effective solution in terms of air quality and climate change. We as a society have shot ourselves in the foot several times in terms of climate actions that then have air quality disbenefits, such as encouraging wood burning in urban areas, was something that was very hot for a while. We had a vehicle excise duty that promoted diesel because it had 2% less exhaust emissions, 2% less CO2 emissions, but it actually had an 80% increase in particulate pollution at that time. So one of the reasons we have so much air pollution around today, when 20 years ago we thought we'd have solved it, is because we tried to incentivize climate change without looking at kind of the wider impact. So you do avoid kind of unintended consequences by taking this wider perspective, but also we can find cheaper and more cost-effective policies. So, for example, if you've got a climate project or policy that will have an air quality benefit, then roll it out first in a place that already has an air quality problem. And there's some real kind of low-cost wins there. There's also opportunities for kind of effective planning for resilience, and also looking at things like, well, what motivates people? A lot of people find climate change can be quite a disempowering thing because of the scale of the project, the problem, and the scale of what we as individuals can do. But actually, everybody has friends and family who have air pollution health impacts. And actually, you know, by linking the two together, we can kind of motivate people directly on what issues they're concerned about. There's also a question of, you know, motivating them to take action right now, rather than, you know, and seeing immediate benefits, rather than something that, you know, with the climate lag, you're looking at global long-term problems, but actually here and now solutions. And there's a real good connection between air pollution action there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the climate change guidance that we're putting together at the moment. Sorry, excuse me one moment. This is actually an update on some guidance that EP UK launched back in 2013, which is air quality and climate change guidance for local authorities. And it's practical bottom-up guidance for local authority, climate change and air quality officers, working on sort of, because a lot of the time local authorities are having to have a statutory duty to work on local air quality management. They have to produce air quality strategies if there are any exceedance in their areas. But at the same time as this, a lot of local authorities are declaring climate emergencies and developing climate action plans. Not a statutory responsibility, coming very much from the championing side of things. And these are often being developed in isolation, different departments, sometimes even different kind of levels of government, working on these in terms of key stakeholders. And this guidance was really trying to bring together that process and those relationships so that both of those types of documents would be more effective. In terms of the 2013 guidance, we had some really good feedback from air quality officers at local authorities about how useful it had been and how they'd been using it to engage with climate change people, but there was actually limited take up by climate change officers at that time. 2013, obviously now quite a long time ago, there's been a lot of policy development, there's emerging technology has come out, and so this guidance was getting quite dated. And there's also been, since then, a number of publications which looked at kind of the top-down level. What is the impact on air pollution going from for net zero, for example? And that's been very useful, but still didn't address the, okay, I've got to write 2 strategies. What practical action should I take? So we started looking at this when we were still at EP UK, but it's now been taken up by EPIC, and we have an air quality guidance task group that was set up in 2023. That task group pulled together an exposure draft, which was launched at the EPIC launch event in February and circulated widely for reviewers. An exposure draft, we called it that because it's essentially a consultation draft combined with a call for evidence. The guidance is so broad that there was no way we could capture every expert opinion within the steering group meeting. And so we released it on that basis. That actually ran from February till April, and we also held some focus events, focus groups with local authority representatives. We were really pleased to find that we had kind of both sort of air pollution experts and some climate experts, but also we had sustainability. I think we had the odd transport planner, we had the public health teams, and this is exactly kind of the reach we're hoping to get. If any of you would like to have a look at kind of what's going on, I have put the link in the presentation, so you can have a look. That is still up there, but comments are, the consultation has now closed. And as part of that consultation, we had 27 detailed written responses. We had 40 local authority people, representatives. We had quite a lot of responses from kind of local authorities. We also had quite a lot of responses from kind of NGOs, whether they were local NGOs or kind of national health bodies in particular, and organisations who worked on kind of sustainable transport, and so on. And we were really pleased that we got some reaction from kind of government and government bodies. So generally very supportive. Quite a lot of extra information was provided, which was brilliant. And quite a lot of extra case studies were provided, because that was something that people were particularly interested in seeing. So what actually does it contain? I thought I'd just briefly talk you through this, because there's no way I can fit the entire document into one presentation. After the introduction, we talk about why it matters, why are we looking at this, and both in terms of the air quality and the climate change, but also the interactions between the two and the benefits of integrating the policies. And then we talk about kind of how to develop an integrated approach, and that looks at, you know, decision makers and bringing them on board, the importance of elected members, the importance of relationships and how to kind of develop that, and where the policies overlap in particular. So what are the kind of key elements, and also linking in with other areas. I've just realized I've just written environmental areas there, but actually some of the key audiences for this work is not actually the climate change or the air quality officers. It's the people who it's going to be them influencing sort of strategic planning, or transport planners, or, you know, outside of a local authority situation, it's going to be, yeah, the people who actually have the control of the sources of pollution and the influence over those. So it's about how you build those relationships. And then the last section is basically different measures that local authorities can take. So just to give you an overview of this, these are the measures that were included in the consultation draft. I believe there's been a few extras added in at consultees' request, where they felt there was a gap. So we look at kind of transport, public transport, shared transport and active travel. We look at kind of control measures. So that includes everything from clean air zones to low emission neighbourhoods, to anti-idling as a measure. And also kind of looking at the vehicles specific initiatives. And then we also look at kind of buildings. So looking at construction, looking at strategic planning, looking at energy efficiency as a measure, because that's obviously something that a lot of climate people work on, but it has additional air quality benefits, because anything you're doing to reduce kind of, you know, whether it's gas central heating, will be wonderful. But also there's some risks there, because when you get into indoor air quality, and if you don't use air tightness properly, or as it's been designed, then you risk kind of ending up accumulating pollution inside the home, where we spent a vast amount of our time over here in Britain. And then looking at kind of energy and heat generation, looking at the non-combustion renewables, which are generally good for both air quality and climate change, and looking at kind of the benefits there, but also looking at kind of things that have more risks. So wood burning, still seen by many as a green fuel, but has massive air pollution impacts, both indoor air pollution impacts and kind of external, and other solid fuels, so, you know, coal burning and so on. We also have an overarching section which looks at things like sustainable procurement, and I think there's been a few extras added in the new version. I've just put a snapshot in. This is actually one of the shorter measures. It looks at energy efficiency. So it flags up the air quality impacts in terms of hotspots, air pollution hotspots, but also on emissions and on climate change emissions. And we use a traffic light system for that. And there's a summary kind of elsewhere in the document. It also looks at kind of what some of the other impacts. And you can see there, we've got health, local economy, low income residents, all have kind of generally positive ones. This indoor air quality issue we flagged up as a negative, but then we go into detail in terms of the support mechanisms. Apologies if that typo, that was correct in the final one. So where can you get extra support? What can local authorities do? What are some of the issues? And lots of links for you to find out more. And we also look at we wanted to score them. These are the top 10 issues, measures you could take. But when we looked at it in more detail, we actually realized it depends what you're trying to achieve as to which is your top 10 measures. So we've actually looked at, well, what are your priorities? Is it to do with the most impactful air quality measures or the most impactful climate measures? Is it looking at the best win-win measures? Is it looking at measures for schools, and so on? So there's lots of different ways we've kind of packaged it up. So that to help local authorities and others look at this. So I will come to an end there. Just to bring you up to speed on the next steps, we're doing the final edits underway and adding in a lot of additional case studies. Publication due in the autumn. Do join the IES EPIC mailing list if you'd like to know about that. And the plan is to hold a feedback event. So, you know, once it's been in use for a while, find out how people have used it. Is it fit for purpose? And just a couple of questions for you, really. Would you use the air quality and climate change guidance? If so, how and when might you use it? What would make it more useful? We're really keen that it reaches the right people. So how can we identify and reach those, the people who need it and would find it useful? And would you find a shorter briefing version of the guidance, maybe aimed at specialist local authority officers or others useful? So, you know, transport planners or building things. So I will stop there and hand back to Derek. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. And if
then,
anyone does,
yeah, no, I was
any
just going to say the
response to those
contact details are
questions,
there.
yeah, if anyone does have any response to those questions, you can message Sarah directly or pop them in the Q&A box. I have a general question for all the speakers, and it would be nice to know kind of just, obviously there's completely different experiences and backgrounds. It would be good to know how, in your opinion, some of the challenges that you faced from interdisciplinary collaboration, and what are some of the better communications and collaborations and other ways that we can implement so that there's a better way of working together for climate action. And that's open to the floor, so just anyone got.
I can sort of say a really basic one that I've come across having moved between various different disciplines. So one of the things that I've really struggled with is acronyms. You know, it's often talked about, you know, it's very easy to fall into jargon irrespective of what industry you work in. But if you go across disciplines, those acronyms can mean something completely different. A good example is EMR, electromagnetic radiation, as was when I worked in engineering and environmental consultancy. And then when I moved across to green finance, everyone kept talking about EMR, and I couldn't understand why electromagnetic radiation was so important for these assets and this due diligence, and it didn't really make any sense. And you can't really do an internet search for that because it kept coming back with things like East Midlands Railway, which doesn't help very much. And it took about 6 months before someone actually said the words electricity market reform, which made a lot of sense at the time. But I think we have to be very careful when we are working across disciplines, the language that we use, even irrespective of whether it's acronyms or not, but the language we use might be interpreted very, very differently. A very recent conversation I had actually with the British Business Bank. They wanted to discuss climate action with me, and they said, oh, this is all CSR driven. And I was like, that seems very strange. Why are you using corporate social responsibility to drive climate action in the British Business Bank? That doesn't sound very good. But actually what he meant was comprehensive spending review, which is how the government allocates their budgets. So it's really interesting, and it can result in some quite significant misunderstandings. So I would say language is a very key one.
Yeah, the recent Sarah mentioned that we had the Dialogue Between Disciplines conference, and that was one of the things that came back from that as well, was the language and the communication wasn't always clear. Did you have any thoughts on that, Sarah?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question for me?
Yeah, just kind of looking at some of the challenges. How can professionals from different disciplines better communicate and collaborate to ensure their efforts in climate action are complementary?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with Emma's. Thank you for that. I would certainly agree with Emma's take on language. There's a point after which it gets uncomfortable to ask, what do you mean by that? But if we're not actually talking about the same things, it's very hard to come to an agreement. I think one of the interesting things is that actually it is about making sure you're talking to the right people in the first place. We can communicate with people sometimes quite effectively, especially if we can find the common ground and what motivates them. But until we've identified who we should be speaking to and who are the relevant people that have the influence or have the control over whatever it is you're interested in, I think sometimes that's the hardest step in terms of kind of getting that interdisciplinary work done. To take that wider perspective, you have to find somebody who's coming from a different perspective from you, and it's very easy to stay in your silo, especially if you work in a large organization or an organization that's quite territorial and department driven, if you saw what I mean. So it's about finding those connections, I think, to a large extent.
Perfect, thank you. And Guy, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I echo the acronym one is a huge one, which we've come across many times. Yeah, especially with like decarbonization tech, it is yeah, always the case. I think what I've experienced is issues with speed of like implementation and delivery. Academia, everything takes absolutely forever in regards to project peer review process, and most academics spreading themselves too thin and having too many obligations, i.e. Teaching obligations, grading like actual research, etc. And things get conceptualized and you get research funding for a set amount of years. But then when you start working with people from outside of academia, whether it's in NGOs, think tanks, etc., you deal with people who 100% of their focus is this shared project that you might be working on, and they're ready to go and get everything done. And then their expectation is to try and deliver it as fast as humanly possible. And then that mismatch can often cause a bit of conflict in these in these project consortiums. So I'd say that's quite a large issue, which would be good to overcome, but not quite sure how to do that.
Perfect, thank you. Sarah, I have a question that's for you. So someone's written, I've noted that only 9% feedback from academics on air quality, climate change and local authority consultation. Do you think this lack of engagement from the academic community is a problem? And if so, why do you think expert community is not engaging, and how do we improve this in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I think there does still continue to be a disconnect between kind of academic experts and practitioners to a large extent. And we as practitioners tend to use the academic research, but we don't necessarily feed back as effectively. And sometimes it's a case of, you know, trying to get the right piece of information out of academic research, because often they've discovered 7 things and only 2 of them are relevant. So I think, yeah, there's definitely an argument for us as practitioners kind of working more closely with academics. It was really good that we got kind of the 9% that we did. And EPIC actually has a number of academics within it, and kind of on our advisory group. And there's also an IES community that specialises in academia. So we're trying to make the most of those new connections. Now we're part of the IES family. I think it's a task for all of us really to kind of continue to work, whether it's through kind of webinars like this or conferences, to make sure that there is a really strong connection between academia and practitioner, to make sure that we're basing our work on the most robust science or findings, social science findings, and different kind of academic outputs. And also, you know, for academics to make sure they're reaching out to us where they see a real world application of something, to kind of reach out and say, we think this could be really relevant to what you're looking at. So.
Perfect, thank you. Guy, I have a question here for you. Plastics debate is very much focused on waste and biodiversity side of impacts. How do we bring in greater discussion about embedded emissions linked to petrochemicals into public communications?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of alluded to this, that it's plastics industry has kind of gone a bit not unnoticed, that's too strong of a word, but it hasn't received the same kind of focus as just like big fossil fuel extractivism. And there certainly has to be more of a much deeper focus on exactly as you say, the level of embedded emissions and all the other negative consequences that come from plastics production. And then to deal with, no, I mean, a lot of people within industry are talking about much more about kind of like circular modes of production and like chemical recycling and what have you. But the reality is we need to massively reduce demand of reduction as well, and to just kind of shy away from that question is irresponsible on a scientific basis, not on a moral basis. And the level of like superficial production we have is needs to be curtailed to a massive extent. So raising awareness of that through a collaboration of academia and practitioners, as Sarah alluded to, is absolutely integral. As the level of embedded emissions within plastics and other downstream fossil fuel production, such as petrochemicals, is vast, as we are starting to find out.
Perfect. And I have a question, Emma, here for you. How do you see the use of codes such as woodland and peatland codes linked to carbon credits in terms of trust and acceptance and private financing?
It's a very good point. So trust and acceptance, definitely. So it is really beneficial to have these codes dealt with, implemented. The difficulty is that the market is actually really small for those particular types of projects. What that means is capital. I think one thing to be aware of, and for those of who aren't in this all the time, capital is not constrained. in this area, which is a really strange thing to think about. If you work in any other area of environment, there is always a constraint to the amount of money available to you to do a project or whatever, and you've got a situation where, you know, it's a case of which project can we do, and we've got to figure out which is the better one. That's not typically how it works in the infrastructure finance space. There is plenty of money available. The capital is not the issue. Funnily enough, what is the issue is how big the projects are and how big the pipeline is. One of the numbers, and this number was thrown out sort of 5 or 6 years ago, so it could easily have changed, but one of the numbers that was thrown out for the biodiversity net gain, for example, was a project pipeline of about 200 million. A lot of banks won't even get out of bed for that. That is not big enough. For if you think about all of the different teams that I talked about, educating them all, bringing them all up to speed, getting them comfortable with the risk, making sure that they've integrated those considerations into their day-to-day processes. 200 million is probably one project's worth of effort that they would want to put in. And that is the issue that we face in the finance world, is the capital flows are so big that it's easy for the really important smaller stuff to get lost. So I would say that you know, these codes are very, very important because they provide a level of assurity that the risk teams and the technical teams would want to see. But you then have to go through that internal education process in order to teach them what the Woodland Carbon Code even meant and how we can rely on it and how much we can assure it can be useful for us. So it's a good start, but it isn't the only answer.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. That is it for the questions. So I just want to say thank you to each of you for your presentations. That is it from us today. Attendees, thank you for logging in. I hope you found it beneficial and informative. Don't forget to record your attendance at this webinar on the IES CPD tool. You can do that by logging into your members area. The webinar has been recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. If you are interested in finding out more about the IES climate action community and how you can get involved, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And I'd also recommend that you take a look at the upcoming London Climate Action Week events. Our next IES event is on the 1st of July and is on making sense of environmental problems using a systems thinking approach. You can register for this on our website, and that's free to attend. And again, thank you to everyone for attending and for each of you presenting. Thank you.
Thanks, Amis.